Hi, I'm Penny Beeben with Uber Positive Love and one of the canine coaches with Crazy2Calm Canine Coaches. I just want to go over a couple of ground rules for the day. It really helps if you stay muted unless you've been asked to speak. We might go through some questions, or you might have a question based on what we're talking about or something you want to add. So you can raise your hand one of two ways. You can either use the reactions button to raise your hands, or if your camera is showing, you can simply just stick your hand up in the air and we will see that as well. And so you can do either one. You can also type your questions in the chat, but if you stay muted until we ask you, it just prevents the flashing on the screen in the replay, so that if anyone does have a seizure disorder or flashing lights triggers seizures or migraines, that really helps when only one person is talking at a time. And so that's really basically our only ground rules is stay muted unless you're the one that has been given permission to speak, not really permission based, but just given the floor. And then this is an open discussion. It's meant to be an open discussion. We can chat freely. If you're wondering about something and don't know if it's really on topic or not, just type it down in the chat and one of the admin will respond that way, and then either call on you to raise your hand, or if you don't want to actually be the one voicing the question, you can send that in a direct chat to either myself or Cindy, and we will both be watching that as well. So you can let us know if you want us to field a question because you don't want your privacy revealed in the question. So we're happy to do that. And so today we have a special guest, Jack Fenton. And I could go through his whole long bio. I'll kind of let him do that if he wants it out there. I love to have Jack here. He's been here once before. Every time I talk to him, I feel like he's somehow related to me, possibly a brother, distance cousin or something, but we are just very much in agreement in our philosophy with dog training. And so I always like to have people like that in the group. And so I just thank him there. And Jack, if I had a possible way of sending you a coffee, I would send you a coffee.
Oh, thank you.
I know how you like your caramel latte.
I do like my caramel lattes. This is very true. Probably my most defining characteristic. I think if you ask my students, they'd be like, sum him up in one thing, and they'd be like caramel latte. So I don't know if that's a good thing or not. But yeah, thank you for such a nice introduction. I won't, as you say, go through my incredibly long bio that I send out to plenty of people. I'll just talk about the stuff that I think is relevant to the discussion that we're having. So I started off my career training assistance dogs, service dogs, whatever, for an organization down here in Dorset in England. And I worked with them and worked within the assistance dog sphere full time, I suppose, for a number of years. And what I found is that while that was very successful in terms of where I had a lot of dogs with the organization that were put out, we worked for a whole host of different things. So it would be physical tasks, it would be hearing tasks, it would be a few scent tasks, although not a lot. And it would be kind of tasks designed to mitigate, the kind of seizure alert and things like that. So it was a whole host of different things we did. And the issues that I ran into were that I was coming across dogs who, which I'm sure a lot of us can empathize with here, who weren't exactly perfect from the ground up in terms of what we would look for in a service dog, but the issues themselves weren't end of the world, right? It wasn't necessarily that there were things that would kind of wash them or anything, but I didn't know how to deal with those issues because I was given a very narrow subset of training within that sphere. And the rule was, if you couldn't get a dog to a certain standard in a certain amount of time, well, they had to go. And that didn't really sit well with me because I was encountering dogs that I felt could have made it with just tweaking their training plans and tweaking how we handle things. But I didn't know how to do that. So I ended up leaving the assistance dog work full time. I still do it freelance now. I work with a couple of private students. But I then went into what we would describe as pet dog training, I suppose. And then from there, I primarily work with 3 types of dog. So I work with a lot of, in the United Kingdom, there are a big influx of overseas rescues. So rescues from places like Romania and Spain and things like that. And obviously they come with a whole host of complex issues and different things. So I work with a lot of those. I work with a lot of adolescent dogs that I would describe as fizzy, which just means a dog that gets very easily excited, easily aroused by the world. And I also work with a tremendous amount of dogs that we would label as anxious or reactive. Most people also know me, if not predominantly know me, through my work with nose work. So I'm very big on getting dogs to sniff. And so I run a number of classes and behavioral programs dedicated to stuff like scent work, tracking, man trailing, which is on lead search and rescue. And we had kind of what I would describe as kind of the magnum opus workshop, where we had 18 different dogs searching a plane, quite a big 747. Earlier at the end of March, and all of these dogs were dogs that you might have looked at and thought they couldn't achieve that level of kind of skill in terms of they were reactive, they were anxious, they were fizzy, they were all those kind of different labels, but they were all able to do it really, really well. And so I'm really big on the idea of inclusivity with my line of work. Like all of my classes can have pretty much any dog on them, whether they don't like men, whether they're a bit nervous of loud noises, whether they are, incredibly fizzy adolescent dogs. We try and make it as inclusive as possible. So that's me in a nutshell. And the reason why I wanted to bring all of those things up is that I think all of those do kind of tie into a conversation around connection in distracted environments, right? Because when we are talking about connection, I think it's important that we define what that is. And maybe this is a controversial opinion, I don't know. I don't think that you can necessarily give a definitive definition of connection, because I think it's a very individual thing, right? So for example, if I have my French bulldog, Kevin, he is a real definitive looker. So he will literally, he's really dramatic. He will walk and he will do a real kind of, and then keep moving and doing his own thing. That's just the way he is. Whereas a lot of the dogs that I work with do what we would class as a check-in, so looking back really, really subtly. But there is also dogs that don't check in at all, right? Especially when they're doing something like nose work, where actually they're not checking in or looking back at all, and yet they are fundamentally aware of where their caregiver is. And so I always tend to think that one of the mistakes that we make when we talk about connection is the reliance on eye contact and the perception that eye contact means they're connected. I always use the human example, right? So if someone is driving a car and then the driving seat, you're in the passenger seat, they're not looking at you. They're doing a task, maybe quite a distracting class, they're driving, but you're still able to hold a conversation with them and they're still able to listen to you. Because obviously if they turned and looked at you and stared at you, which we would define as connecting, well, they would probably crash the car. And I very much view a lot of the work that we ask dogs to do in the same way, in that I think that while eye contact is obviously a very important aspect for lots of different behaviors and lots of different concepts, I don't think it's the be all and end all. And there are some dogs that I work with who find the act of eye contact not necessarily aversive, but we make the mistake of, especially when we're working in an environment we would find distracting, as presuming that we need eye contact in that distracting environment to get connection. And I don't necessarily think that's true. I especially don't think that's true in a service dog environment, because when I think back to a lot of my early career, when the dogs that we would class as really good were working, there was eye contact, of course, but a lot of them were kind of not staring straight ahead, but they were kind of moving around. They were interested in the world around them. They were aware, but they weren't necessarily constantly checking in. And that was one of the big things that I always found really interesting about connection, was that how can you have a dog who is so in tune, but we're not getting the consistent eye contact that, from a pet dog perspective, whenever I speak with any pet dog caregivers, there is a very big push on eye contact, right? And when you speak to a lot of pet dog trainers too, they talk about what's the definitive thing that you're looking for. Well, eye contact. But when you go into a lot of the more advanced sports, are kind of a little bit beyond what we're talking about today, I'm aware. But when you think about a lot of sports dogs, while lots of the stuff they do does involve eye contact, there's also a tremendous amount that doesn't. Agility is one that, if the dog was constantly looking at you, they couldn't perform agility, but they're probably aware of where you are. So that's kind of my general thesis and kind of overview of what I mean by connection. Connection to me is just an awareness of where, from a caregiver point of view anyway, is just an awareness of where the caregiver is, and what the caregiver's movement and actions mean. That's another really important thing as well, is that very often when I'm working with a person in a distracting environment, so let's say we're in an urban environment like a town center and we're doing some form of behavior with their dog, I tend to think about what does their behavior mean, their physical behavior mean, and the verbal behavior too. What does that mean in comparison to the distraction? Because I think consistency from a connection point of view is so important. So important. And when I talk about consistency, people can sometimes get a little bit, I'm trying to think of the word, when people hear consistency, they think I mean that in an absolute term, right? Like they go, oh, you need to be really consistent. And as people, we actually can't be completely consistent. But what I always want dogs to know from a safety point of view and a confidence point of view, because I think connection and confidence are kind of interlinked, is that your dog needs to know when they are in that space, how you handle those situations, right? So they need to know, for example, what do you do when you're walking past another dog? What do you do when you're walking past a person? What do you do when you have stopped for a second, right? What do you do when you are, I don't know, checking your phone? There's all these different variables. And I think dogs do pick up on those things in general, but we can sometimes struggle to be consistent, because if our dog knows that when we go past a dog, we do this as much as we can, right? Because obviously every situation is different and obviously needs change and our own health kind of changes, doesn't it, as we go throughout. So we can't always be consistent in that manner. But thinking about that is something I think that's really important. In kind of an ideal world, what does our body language, how are we approaching that dog? How are we approaching walking past? An easier example might be a doorway. I know lots of dogs, especially when I was doing the assistance dog work, who were obsessed with doors and doorway. They just loved an open door. I think that's quite a common distraction that we don't realize. So thinking about how we handle those situations and how our body language conveys that, and what our body language means, whether it's, what happens when we tighten the lead, or what happens when we turn, or what happens when we stop. What do all of those things mean? Because if we teach our dog that they mean certain things and certain behaviors and certain rewards, that, I would say, deals with about 50% of the problem with connection, if that makes sense. So that's kind of my general, very brief overview of what I mean by connection. And I'm happy, obviously, to talk more in depth about specific behaviors or specific concepts that I teach. But I just kind of wanted to make that clear to start with, so that we were kind of on the same page of what I mean by it. And obviously we can agree, disagree, that's totally cool. But yeah.
I would totally agree. And I would think most of the people here do as well. I know a few had typed that in the comments. A lot of times we will use the word focus when we're thinking about that. Our dogs focus on us, which to some people also means eye contact, or gets confused for, that constant eye contact. And sometimes it's more of I just want my dog to be in tune with me.
Sure.
And so I think I love that the whole dog training industry is using the word connection a lot more because it fits. It fits what I want with my dog. I don't want to have to verbally tell my dog what to do all the time, all day long. He's chilling on the couch laying next to me, which is what he typically does on a Zoom, or he lays on his bed, or he lays on the cool floor if he's hot, but he chills, because that's what, when I'm setting up for a Zoom, I get everything I could possibly want: my computer, my coffee or water, my blanket, and I get comfy and relax. And he does too. And, sometimes we've had other dogs that we're working with and training on, and that makes it a little bit more disruptive. But it helps when that other dog, that new dog that's coming in, sees my routine of calm, Azul's routine of calm, and they generally will learn that a lot better as well. So one thing, and I know you're really big on this one, how to lead into it. Geez. So connection is the connection, that joining fact between us and our dogs. But there's also a lot of other connections that our dogs experience. And when we use them to our favor, it can be more rewarding for both our dog and easier for us, especially like Azul, when he was an adolescent, was very fizzy. And I love that term, fizzy. That's something I haven't heard elsewhere. But it describes it, because many people would look at him and say he was reactive, when he wasn't really. Yes, he was reacting, but not in what the classical dog trainer would deem reactive.
Yep.
But I mean, everybody's reacting because everybody's alive. You know, if you're not reacting, you're not alive. But so fizzy really fits the way he was as an adolescent, totally. So I love that term. But so I would also work with a lot of reactive behavior type dogs and the barking, lunging, whether it's fear-based, you know, most of them are fear-based, but whatever. And so what I noticed in most of them is that they never really learned to connect with the environment. And so I do a lot of teaching dogs how to connect with that environment. And I know you're really big on that as well. So do you want to explain kind of a little bit about how you use the environment to help build that connection between handler and dog by using the environment and the connection with the environment in when you're around other distractions?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, I think almost everything that we would label as a distraction can also be used as a way to influence our dog's behavior in a way that we like, and also a way that they like too. So I always think about the concept of grass in urban areas. It sounds a little bit weird, but when a dog's in an urban environment, there's lots going on, a lot of stuff that if they don't live in a city or they don't live in a town is probably quite overwhelming and quite different. And so I tend to view grass in urban environments as what I would call a safety spot. So the idea would be that the dog, we're walking through a town, there might be literally just a little patch of grass, even some weeds coming through the crack of somewhere. And my dogs know that if they come across one of those things, provided they don't pull, provided they're not silly, they have full permission to stop and sniff and chill out there for a little bit, whatever that looks like. And one of the things that I found when working with pet dogs is that a lot of the behaviors that we would describe as lacking connection, so pulling on lead, fixating on different things, a lot of that is just due to a lack of processing time. And a lot of that is due with a lack of understanding of what they can and can't do in that context. So for me, a majority of loose lead walking training that I do is based on three things. It's based on assessing whether the dog is stressed or anxious, because if there's that, we take a very different approach. But if it isn't that and the dog just pulls, it's about going, well, what are they pulling to do? 9 times out of 10, it involves sniffing in some way, whether it's going to sniff a person, sniff another dog, sniff grass, sniff a lamppost, whatever. I mean, the third is, again, going back to what we were just talking about, how we relate that to us and what our body language means and what paying attention to us and hanging out with us means. So when I'm working with a dog and we're in an urban space, the question to me is always, how can we teach them that that spot is safety and they can hang out there for as long as they want? Because what tends to happen is, well, okay, you can go to that spot provided we do a bit of loose lead walking or eye contact or whatever label we want to, whatever focused behavior, whatever connective behavior we're talking about. And very quickly, they learn that not only do they get access to those things by checking, and by saying that, I don't mean they should do that all the time. I'm just talking about in terms of a loose lead walking perspective. But very quickly, they learn that actually they're allowed to stay there for as long as they want to, within reason, obviously, but with as long as they want to. And what they then do is they process everything else. So they go and they stop and they process. And then once they've processed, their desire to go and check out other things lessens, because they've actually already done that processing. We've given them an opportunity to stop. A lot of the time when we're thinking about distracted environments, the dog is bouncing from one thing to another, from one thing to another, from one thing to another. And there's not actually time to pause and reflect. Because I think a lot of dogs need, no matter their breed, need time to pause and reflect and process. And when you give them that opportunity, it opens up the ability to connect in the exact same way that if we walked into a room and someone was playing really, really loud music and someone was trying to talk to you, we wouldn't go, the first time you'd go, what? And then we wouldn't go, well, that's it, you're not connected with me. It would take time, and ideally, we'd lower the sound of the music, but it would take time to process and understand and kind of tune into what they're saying and go, oh, you've just asked me how I'm feeling. Well, this music's kind of quite loud. Could we maybe turn it down? So I tend to view a lot of connection issues and distracting environments as an issue with processing, not so much an issue with the relationship or even what we've taught the dog in that space, because a lot of people jump to, oh, I need to use more food, or I need to use more toys, or I need to be more interesting. But actually, in my experience, if we give the dogs time to process a situation, especially if it's a situation they go into often, so hospitals are a really key one, or appointments or whatever it might be, giving the dog time to process those things repetitively over and over, and that becomes a bit of a routine, that lack of connection dissipates, because the dog then has the mental scope to connect with you and is able to go, oh, I can actually, you know what, I've spent some time actually thinking about this, I've sniffed it, I've seen it, I've heard it, and I'm now able to engage with you, whether that is in terms of you were then able to do the training necessary to get them more connected with you, or you might not even necessarily need to do that because your dog is just more connected with you because they've kind of tuned in with the rest of the environment. So that's one. Yeah.
I think that really applies to, like you had mentioned earlier, some dogs that just are too distracted by every doorway. And I think that's a huge one in the service dog world that people don't think about, is how distracting doorways are and how to do those doorways safely. And like one of my very first things, I work with a lot of dogs, service dogs, therapy dogs, whatever, that are going to be going into a wide variety of environments, and taking them out on some of their very first situations into pet-friendly places. And so I always go and hang out in that doorway area first. You get their focus around the car, or, wherever, when you get there, you find their focus. Maybe you're hitting a green space is what I usually call it. That grassy area, that place where there's trees, that green space, where you're letting them have their time to sniff and process the outdoor environment. You do the same just before you walk through the door. And where I'm at, we actually have a lot of double doors. So especially because of the colder climate. So you have a door, and then you have a space, and that space might be small, just enough to block the winter elements or whatever from getting in. Or it might be larger, like if you're at a grocery store, there might be carts in that area or whatever. But you have the space before you move into the actual environment of the store. And a lot of service dog handlers, when they're training that young service dog in training, they don't think about just hanging out in that space and allowing that space, because in our area, maybe not all areas, but in our area, that space is generally carpeted, because it's a way of cleaning off people's shoes. It has like the outdoor style carpet, but it's a way of cleaning off shoes so they don't have to clean the interior as often. And so, and you might have a better fact or more statistic, I just barely remember. Dogs actually smell scents that are generally up to 3 weeks old. Mm-hmm. So if a dog walks through there in the last 3 weeks, or think of all the hundreds of people that may have walked through that area in the last 3 weeks with snow melting off their boots, or, whatever, they just walked through a farm and walks through there. If you're practicing in like a farm store, there's all kinds of smells in that area. And because it's in the closed doors and wind, the smells tend to linger and circulate in that area. So the smells originally are totally overwhelming and scare a lot of dogs. A lot of dogs are great once they get in the store, but are fearful in that doorway. And I think smells have a lot to do with it, and the fact that they were never given that time to process that environment, to sit there and enjoy and watch, oh, people come in this way, they go out that way, in this way, out that way. People would, I'm not interacting with anybody, or maybe this is my place for greeting people, whatever it is the handler has decided is appropriate in that environment. But it's just that chill, and I'll stay there until I have that, till I feel that connection with my dog. And so with a young dog, that might take 10 or 15 minutes. And if our outing is only 15 minutes, that's all we do. We get in that area and we leave, So the more you do it, the shorter that time becomes that you need to be in that area, because they get used to it and can process it a lot faster. I think that's one of the really, really big distracting environments that a lot of people just simply overlook and don't think about. Do you have any kind of good doorway tips, maybe, or different things in other environments like that, other environments that might be more distracting?
Sure. So I think for me, I would view, I would always ask, what does a doorway mean? Right. So whenever we're thinking about any form of distraction, I want to change that distraction into a cue of some description. So before I go on to that, I will say as well, harking back to what you've just spoken about, Penny, because I think it's really true, is that whenever I'm thinking about socializing a assistance dog prospect or getting a dog used to a distracting environment, I don't go to the distractions, they come to me. Because that's the point, right? Is that if we can't stand and chill in a space for X amount of time and we're getting no distraction, we shouldn't really be adding in movement, because what we should be able to do is get a point. I do something called the connection test, which I will talk about later. I'll answer the doorway things and we can revisit that. But I think it's really important to understand that if you are having an issue with distractions in an environment, go to that distracting environment if your dog is capable and just hang out for a bit and just see how they get on. And just see how long it takes you to get that connection, because that's information in of itself. In terms of doorways and things, my kind of viewpoint with things like that, as I just said, is what do doorways mean? So for lots of dogs, it's a kind of almost huge influx of different smells, different senses you've just highlighted. And it's also very, very intoxicating, right? It's a bit like when we go past a bakery or a restaurant or something, when we get that real kind of big pull. But it'd be a bit like if we could smell, I don't know, toys, or we could smell whatever it is, or sort of like a massive sweet shop, whatever it is, there's something really alluring about it. There's something that dogs really want to find interesting. And so when we're considering how do we handle that, the question that I would have again would be, well, what does that mean to the dog? Well, it means that it's interesting. What do they want to do when it's interesting? They want to go investigate it. So my thing would be, I would put it on cue for that context. I would have a specific cue that means that we're going to go and investigate those smells. But the context is that we don't go through doorways without permission. So if we are walking past a doorway, the goal would be that we would go through lots of different doorways on a PA outing. But it would be a case that the cue would be to start with. I wouldn't necessarily even worry too much about loose lead walking or anything. It would just be, can you wait until I give the cue and we'll go through the door? You can? Amazing. So then we go through the door, they can have a little smell, and then we go back out. Wonderful. Then can we do that again? And then can we do that again? And then eventually build up to going, okay, now I want you to do that, but we're going to do a bit of loose lead walking, and then you're going to get the cue. I view a lot of doorway and boundary work, not necessarily, I don't view it so much as we're just going through a doorway. I view it as its own behavior that I then cue when it ends, if that makes sense. So we'll go through the doorway, go through, and then I'll give like a release cue of some description, which for me is just kind of a body language thing. And then we can keep moving and we can actually start fluently walking, because that transition point is really important. And for lots of dogs is really, really difficult. So that's what I would say for that. In terms of the connection test that I was just highlighting, it's a super simple 3-part exercise. And I tend to do this with dogs who, I mainly use it with dogs who are incredibly distracted anywhere, but it can have its own use in a kind of consistent distracting environment. So the first thing, really simply, and I know we've spoken a lot about lack of eye contact or eye contact versus not eye contact, whatever it is, but I would look for some form of orientation towards my direction, right? So it could be looking at my feet, or it could just be a head turn towards me, and I would reward that. And that's how we start. The dog doesn't do anything else. It's literally just that. And then I would think, if my goal is movement, I would think of a way of adding in a little bit of movement. So it might be the case that I might move slightly backwards and see if the dog is just capable of following me and following my body language. Or I might even do it if movement is a little bit trickier. I might sit there and think about raising an arm or something like that, and just see, can my dog follow my hand movement, or can my dog follow my behavior, or whatever it is, and then reward them for that. And then I would add in a little bit of movement. So can we move backwards? Can we move ever so slightly forwards? Can I move this, that, and the other? And what you tend to find is that if a dog can do all 3 of those steps with some degree of success, then you are capable of moving through an environment. My golden rule is that if a dog can't do one of those things, we move back to the other one. So let's say that I get a dog who is able to orientate towards me, but I move my hand and they just can't focus on my hand. Well, we just reward the orientation a lot more. If we get to the stage where adding in movement is too much, I focus on just them being able to follow my hand, or following a little bit of movement, depending on everyone's different capabilities. But I think having a little test, and you can modify that however you want, that you do at the beginning of a distracting environment to actually check. Because a lot of the time we don't check if our dog is connected with us really. We just presume, and then we get upset if they're not. So having a little test that you can run, which is, hey, are we on the same page right now? Is there anything that you need? I find to be really, really valuable. I also tend to notice and pay attention to how much my dog is sniffing, because if my dog is sniffing a great deal, it tends to tell me, not necessarily that we're not connected, but that there's a lot of conflicting things going on in that space, in that environment. And that'll be a period of time where I'll go, right, I'll go and find the next safety spot, or I'll just hang out for a period of time here in this moment, see what my dog does. In terms of specific distractions, I'm going to talk a little bit about nose work, and it will relate back to what we're talking about. So with the nose work that I do in a lot of my online classes, we do something called the coin game, which is effectively where, I won't go into all the details, but a lot of the dogs that I start working with from a scent work perspective, and scent work just means a dog finding a scented article in a search area and performing a behavior to find it. So it's very much like drug detection, dog stuff and things like that. And the goal with that is that we start with coins. And the reason we start with coins is that most people have coins. They're really easily accessible, and they're very difficult to find with the dog's nose. The logic being that if you can get a dog to find a coin, you can get a dog to find any other scent that you want them to do relatively easily, which is my experience with it. But anyway, we teach this by doing something called the coin game. And effectively, all the dog needs to do is stare at the coin. That's it. All they need to do is just look at that coin and go, the coin's here. And it can just be on the ground. It can be wherever it wants. And one of the very early things that we do is we build distractions into that behavior. So what ends up happening is distractions become what's classed as a keep going signal. So the dogs that I work with, if someone touches their back and they're indicating, they indicate better. They focus harder, because that's a cue to them that, right, someone's touching me. Okay, I'm going to really, really focus on this. Or, for example, they'll do it around other dogs playing. Okay, well, other dogs are playing, so I'm going to really, really focus on this coin. And what you tend to find is that you can take that same logic and you can apply it to other situations. So I worked with an assistant dog handler once who, I will go into all their personal details, but effectively they had a condition that made them have very public, I'm trying to think of the correct terminology. Effectively, a lot of people would come over if they had an episode in public. And what that would do is that would distress them quite heavily. So what we ended up teaching the dog to do is that the more people, and we proof this with stooges, the more people that approached, the stronger the dog's block was. So the closer the dog got to the person. And that proved to be really, really effective. And so what ended up happening is that rather than being distractions, they actually became strengths, because the more things that happened in that space, or the more people that appeared, the more dogs that were playing when they're freezing on the coin, the more actual physical touch that there was, the stronger that behavior became. And the way that you do that with everything is that you have to be consistent with it, of course, but it's about going, what does my dog find distracting? And what do I actually want that to mean for our relationship? So a really common one that I always think of from an example perspective is bread. So when in England anyway, we have big bread aisles. And I don't know why, a lot of the dogs that I used to work with when I did assistance dog work full time used to really like the bread over everything else. Don't know why. Bread was just in. But it used to be a big issue because they used to go and literally sniff all along the bread. And it was like, oh my goodness. And we would do leave work and we do all this stuff, but just the bread was so intoxicating. And so what we needed to do is we needed to not go, well, you can't have the bread. We needed to just change what bread meant. And so what we did a lot of work with is that when they would look at the bread and then they would look away, they would get a reward. And that's all we asked them to do. And what very quickly started to happen is that their focus in a supermarket was the best when we were down the bread aisle, because bread meant, oh, if I look away and pay attention, I get a reward. And I think that you can apply that to lots of different things, right? The only thing that I would say I would be a little bit careful of is that there are certain things that we do not want to make an association with necessarily. So when I'm thinking of prey animals or farmyard animals, a lot of the work that I will do with dogs early on is it's just, here's a donkey, here's a cow, here's a pig, here's a horse, here's, a squirrel. And some dogs are obviously more genetically predisposed to go, oh, and really focus on those things, and we would handle that a little bit differently. But if it's something that the dog might be interested in, but I don't want them to develop an association with, we just hang out around that thing until it's boring, right? Like, I don't particularly want my dog to make an association with cars, is a really common example. I don't want cars to actually mean anything. They're just cars. So I don't do any of the work. Whereas something like food on the floor, well, that's going to have an association anyway. So I need to change that association, if that distinction makes sense with what I'm saying. So that would be the only thing I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. And to use an example around here, we have a lot of deer in the wild, and a lot of dogs really struggle with wanting to chase those deer. And we also are lucky enough to have an enclosed park, and it's actually maintained by the city. When deer hang out in the city too long, they can become a nuisance. So that they end up in the closed park, they will try to take them out further away from the city. And if they make their way back, they end up inside the enclosed park, which means I'll have this large area with a, 20-foot tall fence, a really tall fence. And so I will take from the time I get a dog to that area and just hang out there until it's boring. I mean, I've had deer come up and kiss my dogs before through the fence and lick each other and think it was neat and just enjoy. But that becomes our way of showing the dogs that we don't chase deer. We simply hang out and watch them. And they're going to eat and wander and do their own thing. They're of no interest to us. But then I also will do, like you had said, the example you used about teaching that alternate, that this has a meaning already. So let's change that association to mean something else. And that's exactly what I did with people commenting about my dog. And so we hear all the time the words beautiful, handsome, gorgeous, and eyes in reference to Azul. And we've heard that since he was a puppy. And so the association they had before I did any training was, ooh, that person wants to pet me. Let's pull over to that person and go say hi, right? Not the thing we want for a service dog. So I was able to change that association, just like you did with the bread, that whenever anyone said beautiful, he looked at me and he got rewarded. And then we built in anytime anyone said handsome, he looked at me, he got rewarded. And again, we used other people that we could control to say that in the beginning, but then we were able to apply that in public. And so now when he hears somebody say, look at that gorgeous dog, he instantly keys in on me and steps in just a little bit closer in his relaxed heel and a little bit more focused, because he knows he's going to be rewarded, even though he's at a stage now where I don't have to reward him with food and he doesn't even want the food. He's not my food motivated dog, but he knows he's going to be rewarded for that because that's what I want. And he knows that when he does that, when we're done with whatever we're doing, when the job is done and we can step outside, I'm going to let him say hi to some people because that is his reward. That's what he loves. And so it's kind of been that win-win of changing the association from what it was to something that works with us in public. I can get kind of annoyed with everybody who says, what do I do to make people stop looking at my dog? We can't control what other people do. We can only control what that look means to us and our dogs. We can change that. We can build that positive association to make it mean something else. And I think that's something that's missing in a lot of service dog training. A lot of people don't even think about that possibility. So I'm really glad you brought that one up. That is a big one for the service dog community, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know I work with a lot of teams to develop some kind of routine before they go in the store. And so for me, I called it my positions game and when Azul was young, I really reinforced my hand target game. And the moving hand target could go anywhere and get him to move anywhere around my body. And we played it at quite rapid speed and with lots of movement when he was an adolescent, to kind of just, so that was reinforcing in itself. So after that person said gorgeous or beautiful or whatever, and he improved his focus on me, and that person would back off, we would pop into someplace quiet in the store and go through a rapid positions game, because that was his reinforcement for that. We used it that much. But that was my check-in before I walked in. If he couldn't play the game, he wasn't focused, he wasn't ready, and he wasn't paying attention to me. Something else was still too distracting. And so I always tell my teams, your routine may not match mine. This is what worked for me and my dog. You have to figure out what works for you and your dog in a way that can make that a positive experience for you. I don't know if, I know we're actually almost out of time already. So I don't know if you have a whole lot of tips you can share. Like, I know the loose leash walking is a big thing, and I know you have a whole big part of that, but maybe think about if there's one part that you think that most people, either pet dogs or service dogs, seem to be lacking. Like for me, with the aggressive dogs, lack the ability to process the environment. Can you think of one thing maybe that people, I know you have a whole like building block series. What do you think are missing the most?
So I think for me, I think it's clarity, to be honest. I think the one thing that a lot of pet dogs, service dog, all dogs in general, to be honest, lack is clarity. And I think in a lot of ways that comes down to how we've taught them and what we've taught them things to mean. I always go back to recall. And I always talk about potatoes when it comes to recall. So I always talk about the fact that most people quite like potatoes. But if we went to a restaurant and we were served a raw potato, we were probably quite upset, even though we do like potatoes. And I think that when we consider ways that we reward, say, a recall, it doesn't matter what food you have, it doesn't matter what reward you have, it's how that's delivered and how consistently that's delivered. So if my dogs know that when they come back, when I call them, they get to chase a treat and that's their favorite thing, and that's consistent, and there's clarity that my recall cue means we come and do this thing, they're far more likely to do that. And I think that a lot of the time when we teach a dog a behavior, whether it's a task or whether it's just an understanding of the environment, we aren't clear enough with them about what we want, but also clear enough about what that means for them, right? So when I think about loose lead walking, I know we've spoken a lot about, but what does that mean for the dog? Or not only what does that mean for the dog, but what does that mean? What do they get? What does that look like? And that's very individual for each dog's needs and each reward. But I think that for a lot of distracting environments, the reason why distractions are so strong is because they're consistent, right? You used the example earlier about dogs pulling up to people to say hi. Well, that's because for a majority of that dog's perhaps early life in some ways, I'm not talking about your dog specifically, but just in general, a dog then, met lots of people. That's super consistent. They go over, they're a gorgeous dog, and they get fussed. So consistently, that's why, and that's how that habit builds. So when I think about that, again, I ask the question, well, what habits are we building with our dogs? What are we really consistent with? And when we look at our own behavior, and it's partially because as humans, we're not as consistent as other dogs. Or, what does a squirrel do? When your dog goes, no, what does a deer do? Well, most of the time they're going to run. So it's a consistent, we'll chase them. So it's a consistent thing. So I always try and think whenever we're trying to teach a dog anything, not only because lots of people talk about what does it mean to them, what does it mean to the dog, but also what does it mean after they do that thing? What's the outcome? And how clear are we that that's the outcome that they're going to get? Because if there is any doubt, if my dog's way up, what does a recall mean? What do I get? If my dog's way up, what does retrieving that shoe mean? What do I get? If my dog's way up, what does entering a hospital mean? What do I get? And there's any inconsistency, they will always pick the option that either makes them feel the safest or gets them what they perceive to be the greatest reward the quickest. And 9 times out of 10, that doesn't necessarily align from a getting the reward the quickest point of view. Safety, of course, aligns with us. They just might be trying to get safety in a way that we view as, unsure. So clarity would probably be my biggest thing, especially in distractions, because distractions are super clear for our dogs, but we can work on being a little bit clearer, not necessarily more exciting, but just clearer with what we want and what that means for them.
I think that is also a very big one. And, you know, when I think of clarity most often, I think in what am I doing with my body? But we also have to really focus on what does this mean for my dog? You know, what do they think it means and what do I think it means? And how can we bridge that gap to make it closer? You know, so that what they think it means is closer to what we want. And it may not be a giant leap. We may have to do it very, very slowly to get them to merge to that. I've worked with Azul a lot because he is so social with people and dogs. And he's also always been almost over the top with confidence. And because he's got that husky that likes to look at things, because he could sit for hours and stare at dogs walking by and be happy with that. And he would just hold his downstay and watch because that's what he loves to do, right? When he gets stuck, he's stuck. He'll stay there. But so when he was an adolescent, if we were walking, he would get stuck. And that would actually piss off a lot of other dogs because now they have this dog they don't know staring at him. And it's a confident dog. And now they're fearful of it, you know, so then they're behaving badly. So I had to work really, really hard with changing that to mean when you look at a dog, you can only look for so long and we have to look away. And what does that look away mean? And making that look away something more positive than what he was getting when he stared at the dog. I'm telling you, that one probably, he's 3 now, and I've probably been working on that one. So at least since he was 1, and we're finally there. So it's taken me almost 2 years to actually get it where it can be on a verbal cue and reliable about 99% of the time. Once in a while, I got to do, you know, just a little hand on his shoulder and remind him, yes, we really need to look away. That dog is going to behave badly any moment now. And then he knows now that when he does look away, when I ask him to, that as soon as it's safe and the other dog is now distracted or more distance or whatever, that I'm going to let him turn back and watch that dog. You know, when he's not bothering the other dog anymore, when the dog doesn't even notice or doesn't care, then I'm going to let him watch that dog all he wants. Most of the time, you know, occasionally there's still a reason he can't, but, and so that's what he gets out of it. That's what he gets out of the look away is that when it's safe and when it's appropriate, he can then turn and look. And so I think it's kind of finding those things and what helps us meet our dog's needs. I know we only have a few minutes unless we go over like we normally do, but I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions for Jack or even potentially a situation where you're struggling to find that gap between what you want your dog to do and what your dog thinks they should be doing in a particular situation. I'll take any questions at all if anybody has a question for Jack, but that one may be something a little bit beneficial that I can see a lot of people struggling with.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a diverse topic, isn't it? I think connection. I think it covers so many different things. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, that's great. Because I'd be more than happy to answer. But also if anyone has any questions they think after, because that's always the way, isn't it? When you go and you think and then you go away and half an hour later, you're like, oh, damn, I wish I would have asked that. You can also just ask me again too, or ask you. I'm sure that's fine. So
that could be one thing that we could end on. What is the best way? Like, obviously I have lots of connections for you. What would be the best one to put in our group for people to reach out to you if they want to reach out to you?
Oh, really good question. Can I say 2?
Yep.
Oh, so my Facebook page, which is Jack Fenton, the Dorset dog trainer, is probably the best one for consistent content. But the other one would probably be my email list, which I can send a link to. And the reason I bring that up is that, and which I tell people on the email list, is that if people email, I can't promise that I will reply immediately, but I always tend to reply to a question that someone has or a kind of query or something like that. And one of the things I've started doing in my big email list is that every 2 days, you get a little video no longer than 5 minutes of me talking about a topic and talking about a discussion. I think you've seen some of them, Penny. So that's more free content. And I'm just putting together which will go out tonight, actually, my big kind of mid-month newsletter where I talk about everything I've done in the past, everything I'm doing currently, and then everything I'm going to do in the future. So it's a really good way of getting an overview of a little bit more about me, the work that I do, and lots of the other fun things that I've got coming up. So those probably two would be the best.
And how do they get on your email list? Just simply send you an email and ask to be there?
So there's a link that I will give you, and effectively you click that form. And what you also get as well is you get a ebook that has my top 5 training tips on it. So it's just for free that you can look whenever you want.
And I know I've done it. I just couldn't remember how because it was been a while. I do really like the 5-minute videos. And I was thinking I may start a similar thing.
You should do.
I'll do it email wise only because I don't have a really big email following. Most of my people are either on Facebook or my website. But yeah, I was thinking about, just that 5-minute tip on this particular topic, whatever the topic is, this week. And usually my topics kind of go with the theme of the month as well. But I think that video that you're doing is something that's really helpful to an awful lot of people. Go ahead, Cindy.
Ashlyn made the comment that that Daisy likes to bark when excited, and I've actually been working with a couple of clients on this, so I'd like to hear what your take on how to manage this issue.
Sure. So for me, barking is a really strong expression of excitement, right? And I think it kind of gets information that the dog's probably a little bit too over threshold. But what I tend to think about and how I tend to approach it is, again, I think a lot of barking is a processing issue. And so the thing that I always ask and always wonder is what association does a dog have with the thing that they're barking at, whether it's the environment, they're just in it and they're excited, or what does that thing mean? So I have a concept that I call red, amber, green, which is a specific routine that we get dogs to do who are particularly fizzy. And what is within that routine is really dog dependent. But effectively, to give an example, let's say that you're getting a dog out the car. That would be the green zone. You're walking through the car park or going through the car park and the dog's getting really excited and really wound up. That's the amber zone. And the red zone would be that you begin a dog walk and they're so wired and so excited that you get all this really excited barking. So for each of those steps, the green, the amber, and the red, you would have a behavior or a routine that you would follow through to get the dog working and connecting with you. So for the example of getting a dog out the car, it'd be scattering some food. And then it would be in the car park doing a bit of loose lead walking or a connection game or something like that. And then when we head to that transition point, which tends to be we're heading further into the exciting space or around that exciting trigger, it is doing something that either matches that excitement or has a really strong learning history behind it. So for a lot of the dogs that I work with, it'll be chasing food, or it'll be nose work, or it'll be something that is really, really strong and really, really focused. And so I always ask when I'm thinking about excitement and fizz and barking because of excitement, where does that start? Like that really safe green area, where does it begin to build the amber, and where does it kind of explode red, and then figure out a way and a pattern of dealing with that. So if it's for other dogs, it could be the case of we get to an environment with other dogs, that's great. We spot another dog coming in the distance, that's amber. And then when the dog gets into a certain distance from you, they're kind of over threshold and we get the barking and the lunging, not necessarily in an anxious way, just an excited way. That's red. So what steps do we have to take for each of those? And that's very, very dog dependent. But I find thinking about it from that perspective and trying to figure out what you can do in the routine that you can build is really, really good, because fizz and excitement are just as much of a habit as confidence and things like that. So that would be what I would say for that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that helps.
Cool. Amazing.
And you did a big thing on fizz not too long ago.
Yes, I did fizzy
That's
February.
something that is available. Have you put that together in any kind of like class or workshop that people can go through that anymore?
So the plan currently, when I get my act together, is to release that webinar that I did as kind of a standalone thing on my website that people will be able to purchase. But there are current plans towards the end of this year to run a kind of redux of that, but with an online course component. So a proper full length 4-week fizzy to focus is what I call the in-person workshop that I do, fizzy to focus workshop online. kind of in the same way, in the same vein that I do my online nose work classes. So yeah.
Nice.
Cool.
So I do want to thank you for being here. And I mean, everyone is welcome to hang out. If somebody else has another question, you know, I don't mind. I don't have to rush out, but I also don't want to keep you all day long either.
That's all right. I should probably jet off anyway because I've got to get this newsletter sorted. I'm a little bit behind, but it has been amazing chatting with you all. I really look forward to hopefully coming back again soon. That'd be amazing.
Yes.
For something else.
Please do.
Love to. But
I have
thank you.
a really good guest, and I'm not going to announce the name yet, but I have a good guest coming up for next month.
Amazing.
Talking about myths that are in the service dog world.
Oh, exciting.
Believe are true, but really are not.
Amazing.
And so we're going to do service dog world, dog training in general, and, you know, kind of like myths that people have about force-free training kind of thing and all of that. And she probably is going to come back twice because she has so many ideas and things that we actually want to discuss that it's going to take more than one thing. So you're welcome to tune in on those if you want to.
Yeah, that'd be fab.
They're always on our Working Paws page. But that announcement of who that is and all that's going on is going to be coming out very soon.
Amazing. Cool. Very excited.
Yeah. Yep, it's going to be good. So with that, we'll let you run.
It's fantastic.
Everybody have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.